In fact, I think I will, since I know we have very limited time, we're going to try to keep this session to an hour so as not to strain your Zoom attention. So I'm going to go right ahead and introduce today's speaker, Dr. Meryl Winick, known as Mimi. So I hope you don't mind if I refer to you that way. Dr. Winick comes to us from the Virginia Commonwealth University, where she has been teaching in the English department. She did her doctorate in English literature at Rutgers University. And as soon as we saw her research proposal, we knew that this was really a critical intervention for our field because she has found the roots of gender discrepancies right at the source of the field, the discipline of religious studies, right at the root of our academic inquiry methods that we use. So we're so happy to have her work as part of our program. She's published a number of articles on some of the early women scholars in religion that you're going to hear her talk about today. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Mimi Winick.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for being here. I am so delighted to be a part of this program, and the silver lining of our remote work this semester is that I get to talk to so many of you today who are not here in Massachusetts, but to whom I am in conversation, indebted, and excited to be thinking along with. So I am going to share my screen, so bear with me one moment. All right, I think you're all seeing what I'm seeing now. So as Anne mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about ecstatic inquiry, women's scholarship on religion in Britain, 1890 to 1930. And these years sort of describe the primary texts that I'm concerned with here, but we'll probably end up talking into the 1990s today, maybe get a little beyond in the Q&A. But to start, I'm going to start at the end of the 19th century and talk about this sort of moment and a sort of familiar set of relations among religion, knowledge, and gender at this period. And we'll do that with some help from the folklorist Andrew Lang, whose two-volume Myth, Ritual, and Religion, published in 1887, is the image on this slide. And I should say in general that I've got a bunch of image and text on these slides, and I'll mostly mention the images, but occasionally I'll just sort of use them as suggestive illustrations. But if you ever have specific questions about any of them that I don't talk about in detail, happy to do that in the Q&A. So at this moment, figures like Andrew Lang, working in the emerging fields of folklore, anthropology, comparative religion, were sort of bringing together traditions of thought from a sort of Enlightenment tradition of white supremacist theories of the history of civilizations and a sort of post-Darwin sort of natural evolution into the history of religion and aesthetics. And in projects like these, they sort of had these stage view or stadial views of civilization that racialized religion, and specifically a sort of what's known as sort of a bad, irrational form of religion, as the kind of sort of primitive, credulous belief systems found in tribal societies and still found too among sort of European peasants and globally societies made up of people of color, and also found all over the world among women. And these were characterized by, again, credulity, superstition, or false knowledge, a sort of bad irrationality. And sort of a bad religion that was out of step with modernity. And I think you can really see this on that sort of embossed image on the cover of Lang's book from that 1887 edition. It's a sort of what Lang and his peers regarded as an artifact of a sort of primitive femininity and a racialized femininity. Okay, so this is a pretty familiar constellation at the end of the 19th century. this negative view of primitive, bad religion associated with femininity, and a sort of heavily racialized concept. So I now want to look at what is a related but distinct tradition of thinking and writing about religion, knowledge, and gender. And this is the tradition that I'm calling here ecstatic inquiry. And I think we can start to get a sense of some of the differences in ecstatic inquiry from Lang's sort of model in this image of a Maenad from Jane Ellen Harrison's 1903 study of ancient Greek art and religion. And you can kind of see some of her texts talking about these Maenads as possessed, magical, and dangerous to handle. And so one of the ways that I'm going to be talking about this idea of ecstatic inquiry as exemplified by work such as Harrison's is that it's a scholarly and a spiritual practice. So you've got this sort of example from a scholarly text. It features both the sort of methods of a very up-to-date science, as well as an embrace of mystical methods. And it sort of features and pursues research as a form of ecstatic ritual. And it features specifically, as in the case of Harrison, women in the position of scholars, writing about women in history, like these Maenads, as well as feminized knowledge practices. Okay, so what do I mean by this, and what does this look like in the theories of ecstatic inquiry? So we have a very similar sort of archive of sort of anthropology, early comparative religion, racialized so-called primitive religions in works such as Harrison's, but it's treated in a very different way. And so whereas with sort of Lang and his male peers, you get a sort of so-called primitive religion that's seen as a sort of earlier denigrated form of religion. In Harrison's work and other ecstatic inquiry, this so-called primitive religion is originary and sort of therefore close to sort of a sacred origin, this sense of like an essential, original, true religion. And instead of being associated with false knowledge, it's understood as featuring, well, other forms of knowledge, different knowledge practices. And instead of mere bad irrationality, it features a joyful, celebratory ecstasy. And it too is associated with women, but women in positions of power. So there's sort of this romanticization of this so-called primitive religion in the work of Harrison and her female peers, as I'm going to be talking about today. And I want to argue a little bit further that in this work, in this tradition of ecstatic inquiry, you get an idea that religion as a marker of women, of knowledge, of sort of ways of being and feeling, is itself modern, is sort of a modernizing power. And specifically, religious experience as a marker of modern knowledge, that religious traditions are necessary to the future of knowledge, and indeed are part of sort of modernizing projects in aesthetic and social change. And I'm featuring here a painting by the American painter Agnes Pelton, who has a big exhibit at the Whitney in New York just now. So this sort of stuff is in the air, and I'm excited to talk about it. But back from the US and over to the UK, into my sort of area of specialty, let's look at our actual ecstatic inquirers, and I'm going to introduce them to you more fully. So we've already talked a little bit about Jane Ellen Harrison. I'm also going to introduce you to Jessie Laidley Weston, her exact contemporary, and Margaret Alice Murray. And I've got sort of images of their books from mid-20th century reprints. So each of them was an expert in her field at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Harrison in classics, Weston in medieval studies, specifically medieval romance of the Arthurian legend. And Margaret Alice Murray was a pioneering Egyptologist who worked under Flinders Petrie in the field, sort of wrote reports from the field in Egypt that my colleague Miriam Ayad tells me are still in use today in the discipline. But she was also a folklorist, later president of the Folklore Society, and her best known work comes out of that side of her work, which was the witch cult in Western Europe. And you can see those covers there. So I'm going to pause for a moment just to say where we are here. I've kind of done a little bit of an overview of what I'm talking about with this idea of ecstatic inquiry, this tradition, who might be involved. I'm going to do a bit more detailed introductions to these figures. Then we'll talk about their reception. We'll do a slightly deeper dive further into Harrison's theory and practice of ecstatic inquiry to sort of look at the stakes of this project. And then I'll make some sort of suggestions and conclusions in the concluding section, and then we'll be able to open up for the Q&A. So back to our main figures, some sort of portraits in painting, photography, and sculpture of these women sort of at the height of their careers. Harrison, this is the official portrait of her that hangs in Newnham College, Cambridge, where she was trained and where she ultimately made her career as the first female research fellow. So this cohort sort of had a lot of firsts, a lot of sort of pioneering steps. The third in the cohort, Jessie Weston, not on this slide, was also did not have an academic affiliation. Murray had an affiliation with the University of College London, where Petrie was. But Weston had an affiliation with the Quest Society, a sort of quasi-occult group, and we can talk a bit more about the place of occultism and other new religious movements in these practices. But I save Weston to the next slide because, as far as I know, there is no extant portrait or photograph of her, even though in her own time, she was actually one of the best known. Her book, From Ritual to Romance, which if you've heard of, you may have heard of in connection with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which helped make it particularly infamous by citing it in the endnotes to the poem as the key to the title and symbolism of the poem. But despite sort of the fame of Weston's book, which after it was published, won the Rosemary Crawshay Award for the best study of English literature by a woman, there's this sort of strange gap in the archive. And I think you'll see how this is part of the story. But a little bit of a further introduction to these women's theories and methods. So in Jane Harrison's classical scholarship, which by the early 20th century was highly focused on religion, her main theoretical contributions was sort of building on the theories of J.J. Bakoven and other sort of civilizational theorists that the sort of earliest societies had a matriarchal or matrilineal form. And Harrison, influeed by and in conversation with Durkheim, who she in her letters sometimes refers to as the divine Durkheim or even the divine D, sort of believed that religion originated in social practices, social rituals, and so it was a reflection of society. So matriarchal societies yielded goddesses, and so she had this idea that the goddesses come before the gods in the history of religion. And that too, ritual and myth were sort of co-emergent phenomena out of social practices. And so this was important because for her, myth wasn't just a tissue of errors or sort of bad science, it was also an expression, a religious expression. Margaret Murray's major contributions, you can kind of see some connections with Harrison's theories, and these women were reading each other and knew each other's work. So witches practiced a sort of ancient fertility cult, pagan fertility cult, according to Murray, that also sort of featured goddesses before gods. And they were, in her biggest innovation in the history of witchcraft is the idea that witches were neither possessed by the devil nor simply hysterical. These were the dominant ideas at the time, and they both presented women, right, the majority of witches, as either especially susceptible to Satan or susceptible to insanity. And Murray's approach was to say, no, we need to actually, she kind of was like, believe the women, we need to look at the trial transcripts, and actually if we do that, we're going to see that they were testifying to their faith in this particular witch religion, which she called the witch cult. Jessie Weston's contributions were related to these. Again, we see the sort of goddesses before gods. She made another sort of intervention in saying where Harrison found the evidence of these ancient sort of pre-patriarchal, pre-God religions in art and literature. So she often uses sort of Greek drama as evidence. She always thought it was, she theorized that it was sort of an accidental survival into literature. Weston believed these things were actively preserved as part of a secret tradition. And Weston, as the idea of a secret tradition might suggest, was especially sort of influenced by theosophical ideas of the period. And indeed, from Ritual of Romance does feature a sort of clinching episode where she discusses the astral plane. So as a group, their big contributions were kind of in looking at the origins of religion. Goddesses preceded gods. Women, as Harrison says in one of her works, were dominant and central in this context. Later art and literature preserve these ancient rituals from sort of woman-centered fertility religions, sometimes accidentally if you're Harrison, sometimes more actively if you're Weston. And either way, there's sort of a narrative of the persistence of these woman-centered pagan religions under often patriarchal, Christian, later oppression. So in Harrison, it's sort of a patriarchal Olympian god oppression, and in Murray and Weston, it's a patriarchal Christian oppression. And also that the origins of religion and art, and for Harrison, also philosophy and scholarship, all could be found in ritual. Okay, so this is where pop quiz. I'm going to ask to see how many of you might be familiar with these figures that I've been introducing as ecstatic inquirers. So Tracy, if you're there, would you pop up the poll? Oh, great. So y'all should be seeing a poll now, and you should be able to sort of click which of these figures or their work have you heard of before today? Okay. We've got a nice little pause. All right, so the results, hopefully you can see them too, but I'll read them out just in case. J.G. Fraser and the Golden Bough, 88% of you have heard of. Durkheim and the Elementary Forms of Religious Life, 91%. And then we sort of table off Jessie Weston and From Ritual to Romance is at 53%. Jane Ellen Harrison and either Themis or Prolegomena at 44, and Margaret Murray at 32. So Durkheim and Fraser around 90, and then our Harrison, Weston, and Murray from 30 to 40, or 30 to 50. So a pretty precipitous difference. Okay. That poll, even among an enlightened, informed group such as yourselves, I think indicates something that we can also see in this sort of rather sad image of the bronze bust of Margaret Murray in storage at the Petrie Museum at University College London, among some sort of obsolete computer and filing cabinets. So, I want to talk a little bit about the reception of these figures. So I'm going to use Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance as sort of an example here. Weston's work, Harrison's work, Murray's work, when it was first published, in Harrison's case in the sort of aughts, teens and 20s, and with Weston and Murray in the 20s, it all was sort of widely reviewed in the scholarly press and in the sort of dailies and weeklies. So really, these ideas were really disseminated. And it was reviewed on the whole with praise and some controversy. So you can kind of see in the examples here, we have the prominent British anthropologist R.R. Merritt reviewing From Ritual to Romance and the Athenaeum as scholarly scientific work through and through. And then we have the anonymous reviewer in the Saturday Review, sort of known for its anonymous, sort of nasty but witty reviews, accusing Weston of having an uncritical mind and unquestioning faith, badly influenced by theosophists. And what a fall for a woman who had had a high reputation as a trustworthy copyist of ancient documents and a diligent collector of facts. And if diligent and trustworthy seem familiar to you from those sort of things that circulate about like how not to write about your female students when writing recommendations, right? Don't call them diligent, actually call them brilliant. We can talk more about the history of those gendered terms in this context too. But this was pretty typical, but I should say that the Merritt's kind of reviews really outweighed the negative reviews, although the negative reviews were present. And this was true for Harrison and Murray as well. So this is sort of in their lifetimes through the 1920s, this is sort of the reception of their work. As Harrison and Weston both die in their 70s in 1928, and sort of in the years following their deaths in the 30s and into the 40s, their sort of related fields to which they saw themselves as important contributors, anthropology, comparative religion, were undergoing huge paradigm shifts. So Fraser was sort of going from like the guy, the authority, and ceding to his former student Malinowski, and over in the US, Franz Boas, from sort of like the armchair Victorian anthropology to the sort of fieldwork functionalist model. And Harrison, Weston, and Murray were self-confessed disciples of Fraser. So there was a paradigm shift there. We also have a paradigm shift in the place of sort of professionalization in the academy. That you had a lot of sort of so-called amateur scholars flourishing in sort of para-academic spaces in this period. Even J.G. Fraser, who was a Cambridge Don, published with Macmillan, not with the University of Press. There was sort of like a good relationship among scholarship and sort of amateur gentleman scholar figures in this period that was really in decline. And I will argue that this did affect too the women. So someone like Jessie Weston, who didn't have an academic affiliation, became to be seen as an amateur in a new way. And I think we get a sort of sense of the shift around the reception of Weston if we actually look at her sort of most famous interlocutor, T.S. Eliot. And if we look at the sort of original way he writes about her in his endnotes to The Wasteland in 1922, where he says, you know, so deeply am I indebted. Miss Weston's book will elucidate the difficulties of the poem much better than my own notes can do. So like, go read this book. It will tell you what my famously difficult poem is about. And he goes on, I recommend it apart from the great interest of the book itself, to any who think such elucidation of the poem worth of the trouble. So it's not an uncomplicated endorsement, but it's an endorsement. And in sort of a place where he's working on his own reputation too. 30 odd years later, Eliot will give one of his most famous, well-attended lectures in the enormous basketball auditorium at the University of Minnesota, pictured here, holds a capacity of 15,000 people. And in this lecture, The Frontiers of Criticism in 1956, he really distances himself from that earlier endorsement, writing, it was just no doubt that I should pay my tribute to the work of Miss Jessie Weston, but I regret having sent so many inquirers off on a wild goose chase after tarot cards and the Holy Grail. And again, it's not an uncomplicated disavowal, but there's a real shift in tone that's reflected sort of like if this is the tip of the iceberg, the bottom part is all these scholars in like Weston's home field of medieval studies disavowing her in similar ways on a similar schedule. So I'd like to argue that what we're seeing in some of this discrediting is a story of the return of an earlier model of gendered knowledge connected to this kind of racialized religion. And I think we can see it. It's there in the first reception of these texts in the 20s, right? Uncritical mind, unquestioning faith. And it kind of resurges in the mid-century when sort of reflections like Eliot's A Wild Goose Chase after tarot cards and the Holy Grail, these sort of icons of enchantment, sort of reaffirming of this sort of gender of bad enchantment, of bad religion. And we can see it in the reception of all these figures. So it's there originally. Harrison was accused in 1912 of having this excess of sympathy with like the goddesses that she's writing about. Murray is accused of having a personal bias in favor of the witches connected with her sort of interest in suffrage. And she's even accused by one reviewer of hysteria. And Weston is accused by a reviewer of having a Gawain complex in the sort of like fashionable pathologizing language of the time. And these sort of reviews and these takes that conjure up this sort of gender of bad religion, of bad enchantment, flourish later too. And I think they flourish more effectively later. And they also have an additional valence, which is interesting and important to the reception of these texts. And that is the valence of a sense that these women who were writing about things that could be understood as sort of like suppressed religious or knowledge traditions, the oppression of the witch cult by the inquisitors, as in the sort of image of like Matthew Hopkins' Witchfinder. This is a story that by some starts to be sort of applied to their own work. Like, oh, these women are kind of oppressed, or their knowledge, their texts are being suppressed by sort of a sexist academic culture. And you can see some evidence of this if we do a sort of comparative look at those other names that you were polled on. So in addition, like someone like Sigmund Freud, and then also J.G. Fraser and Emil Durkheim, these figures were still crucial to this sort of canonical figures in the study of religion and other fields, and are sort of central to intellectual history. They too were using the so-called primitive religions in ways that have been, totally discredited, but they were not discredited in the same terms, which are the same effect. So now this brings me to the question of a different kind of reception of these figures, which is the story not just of being discredited, but of persistence. This persistence that sort of echoes the stories that these women were telling about these sort of female-centered religious / knowledge traditions. And one site of this persistence, as we'll see, is sort of Anglo-American counterculture. And so to sort of introduce that, I've got this film still from Coppola's Apocalypse Now, where you've got on Kurtz's bedside table that mid-century 1950s edition of From Ritual to Romance, and another from the same period of The Golden Bough in the one volume. And I want to talk a little bit more about this one volume Golden Bough, which was published in 1922. After the original one first came out in 2 volumes in 1890. This is a cover image of a fabulous reprint edition from Macmillan in 1974 that features cover art by an artist who calls himself Robin Goodfellow. And it's obviously a sort of like fantasy vista. If you look closely, there's not just unicorns and sort of like quasi-Grecian people in togas, but there's some sort of like almost like Philip K. Dickian pink substance in the back. It's very strange. And arguably, I think one of the things we're seeing in this kind of image of the Golden Bough later on is a sort of influence of the ideas of Harrison, Weston, and Murray on the reception of this better known book. that the idea that there's something like strange and ecstatic in the sort of these scholarly religious texts. I'll say more about this in a minute, but I want to bring in another image, which is the cover of Time magazine from 1950, which features T.S. Eliot, framed by this extremely sort of like Westonian imagery of a grail chalice that looks a little bit also like a martini, a sort of woman's very feminine hand holding up a cross. And again, this sort of almost like soft, fantastic landscape that's almost sort of flooding this picture of T.S. Eliot. And what I want to suggest is that these sort of images of Fraser's book, of Eliot in 1950, sort of framed by the sort of from ritual to romance imagery, that these women's work, even though it came in for sort of an extreme disavowal in some quarters, some prominent quarters in this mid-20th century period, also still persisted with the persistence of these better known texts. And it persisted in the idea that a book like The Golden Bough could sort of be a window to a sort of original early true religion, sort of very Harrisonian idea applied to The Golden Bough, that it could be a sort of textbook for other ways of knowing, not just false ways of knowing, and that these sort of images suggest kind of forms of ecstasy connected with these texts, but sort of really framed by the ideas of Harrison, Weston, and Murray. And even the sort of femininity of some of the imagery suggests a place for women. And also spirituality, that you can see some of the image sort of resonance with like the work, the spiritual painting of Agnes Pelton. And we see this even more explicitly in some other sort of elements of the reception of these texts. So the work of Harrison, Weston, and Murray made its way into new religious movements, starting sort of in the early 20th century with something like the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry, which was also inspired by Theosophy and the Boy Scouts. It wasn't all feminist, but also very explicitly in the traditions of Wicca and modern pagan witchcraft, goddess spirituality, the sort of radical theology of Mary Daly, and as the sort of point of Mary Daly suggests, there's also a critical engagement through Mary Daly with some of these ideas by someone like Audre Lorde, who writes that open letter to Mary Daly, criticizing Daly's use of Lorde's words in her own work that's relying on Harrison, Weston, and Murray. But Lorde's idea of the uses of the erotic and the place of joy as a form of knowledge also connects with these sort of ecstatic inquirers in compelling ways. And I'll hopefully have a chance to say more about that in conclusion. Again, I mentioned the sort of American counterculture reception of these things, and I'm mindful of time, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but we can talk more about some of this in the Q&A. So I do want to think a little bit about what happens when we restore ecstatic inquiry to intellectual history. Before that, I'm going to take us briefly through just a little bit more concrete examples of some of what ecstatic inquiry looks like in Jane Ellen Harrison's work. So first, we've kind of talked a little bit about her contributions in theory. I just want to add that in her theory of sort of matriarchy, another thing she introduced was sort of complicating the stereotypes of Victorian gender. So this sort of dance of these armed youths around the baby, and Harrison's telling is an image of sort of like a nurturing young masculinity that's opposed to like a patriarchal Zeusian masculinity. So there was this sort of interest in complicating gender in some of this work. But what I'm really most interested in Harrison here is the place of joy, a joyful ecstasy in her work. So the way she describes religion in ancient Greece really partakes or evokes this sense of sort of ecstasy. So she writes about the Bacchantes, the Maenads, half mad with excitement. They shout aloud the dogmas of their most holy religion. There's a sense of sort of like affirmation there, a joyous religion. And there's not joy only in the religion she describes, but in the practices of scholarship itself. So elsewhere in this same scholarly text, Harrison is describing a sort of scene on a piece of artwork that's part of her evidence for her theory. And she reflects on the joy it causes her as the scholar. And she kind of communicates it to the reader, right? Bringing in the reader with these pronouns, to our delight and amazement. The conjunction rather takes our breath away, this really sort of embodied emotion. And she talks about this in some of her more autobiographical and journalistic writings too. So she sort of is theorizing the place of mysticism, of joy, rapture in scholarly practices. And part of the way she does this is in connecting it explicitly to gender. So this last quote here, where she's talking about the rapture of reconstructing for the first time in imagination a bit of the historical past, which really describes her own methods and practices. This is in an essay that's about how this is something that has long been deemed unwomanly. Later in that essay, Harrison says, historically, between feeling and knowing, there's a certain antithesis. The province of women was to feel. Therefore, they had better not know. But in the longer quote, she sort of describes her own process of feeling in knowing, that intellect is never wholly and separately intellectual. But if you sort of skim the quote, colored by an uprush of an emotion, tears in the eyes, it's sensuous, it's emotional, it's connected to sex. And so there's this sort of like ecstatic gendered inquiry happening for Harrison. And she connects this to this idea of sort of like the future of knowledge, that our present age, she writes, is an age of cooperation and sort of not marked by the sort of usually masculinized individual genius, and even sort of says wittily at the end, the great geniuses are kind of like moot, the great criminals yet remain. We need not fret about it. She's a very humorous writer too. So in brief, what happens when we restore ecstatic inquiry, this kind of ecstatic inquiry we've seen now a little bit more in more detail in Jane Harrison's work, to the stories we tell in intellectual history? First, it complicates sort of linear progress narratives of like the increasing accessibility of academia to women. And I think we can also use this to help us understand the uneven histories of access of academia too, to people of color and people from sort of like non-elite backgrounds, that access is not just a matter of sort of continually increasing certain people's presence, but also of sort of making room for intellectual histories that sort of credit contributions from these folks. Another sort of place that ecstatic inquiry can make a difference in our intellectual histories is in sort of literary studies. There's sort of a wonderful broad group of writers, other scholars like Evelyn Underhill, Janet Spence, Bertha Philpotts, who were doing related work in this period, and then later literary writers who deeply engage with this work in a myriad of ways, sometimes critically, sometimes enthusiastically, often a mix of the two. So kind of a assortment here. As I sort of suggested earlier too, there's a sense that there's a connection between this project in scholarship and projects in literature and art that we can see in some of these sort of blockbuster recent exhibitions of women artists engaged in a kind of feminist spiritual modernism. And finally, in religious studies, we can think about what it would mean to think about Harrison, Weston, and Murray alongside Durkheim, Fraser, and others, and how this might help us inform a different history of this idea of spiritual but not religious. This idea of sort of like a free-thinking, sometimes atheistic approach that is also sort of deeply spiritual and connected to sort of ideas of spiritual ecstasy. And finally, to women's genders and sexuality studies, thinking about how this multidisciplinary, varied field has at different points embraced and disavowed this work, kind of going back to Mary Daly and Audre Lorde, and thinking too about how we can think maybe beyond genealogies and into different kinds of constellations. So sort of the place of joy, ecstasy, and scholarly study, which are topics touched on by Jane Harrison, also Zora Neale Hurston, especially in Mules and Men, Simone Weil, and Audre Lorde again. And even thinking about the place of late 19th, early 20th century Black American scholars like Anna Julia Cooper, heavily involved in folklore and also in medieval studies like Weston, and how we can maybe use ecstatic inquiry to better understand some of their practices, contributions, and reception. Well, thank you so much. I believe we do have time for Q&A. So Anne, I think I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Mimi. And indeed, we do have time for Q&A. You were very disciplined with, with this remarkable group of women. I have a feeling you could have opened up their lives to us. Once I saw that chaise lounge portrait, I knew there were thousands of stories that you could be telling us. I do want to ask you if I could, Mimi, while people are thinking and typing a little bit, if you could give us one very brief story or anecdote that would kind of take us into the experience of ecstatic scholarship, the joy that one of these figures, perhaps Weston, who you have gone so deeply into, that would give us a visceral sense of what made scholarship so joyous to them and how did they experience that?
Yeah. Well, Weston's actually hard because we have so little of her personal writing. So we don't have the same autobiographical content that we do with Harrison or Murray. But one thing we do get that very explicitly in some of Harrison's more autobiographical writing is a sense of the way she experienced her scholarly work as closest to what she knew of religious feelings. So sometimes she would have what you could call a conversion experience in coming to a new theory. But even in Weston's scholarly writing, you do sometimes get this sense of when she's describing a hypothesis and then she presents evidence that seems to confirm that hypothesis, there'll be these little eruptions in the text where there's an exclamation point or just sort of a tone that is not the dry scholarly tone, but really on the page is this sort of moment of excitement and this sort of real, what Lorde in her uses of the erotic terms, a certain kind of like erotic satisfaction in the confirmation of a hypothesis, the coming together of evidence in a theory, or what these scholars sometimes call the bridging of gulfs between sort of apparently far-flung pieces of evidence. And this is something that scholars of religion have sometimes theorized as sort of like a mystical practice, how like comparative methodology and the bringing and joining together of disparate things can act like mysticism. And we really see that in the way they describe the coming together of their evidence.
Well, it's so fascinating to think of a trajectory leading from these scholars to some of the more formative and recent feminist scholars. I'm going to read a question from Aidan Lears, who says, I would love to hear you talk about how this research on women, femininity, and occult spirituality resonates with or even leads into the rising fascination with New Age spirituality, astrology, tarot, but also yoga, meditation, etc. What is it about the way we live today that makes people so interested in such marginalized religious beliefs and practices? And he extends the question, but I'm going to let you answer here.
Yeah, thank you, Aidan. So I think one thing is that we can see how an interest in these sort of so-called alternative or sometimes like subjugated knowledges, rejected knowledges, can feel like a way of doing a kind of critique of mainstream prestige knowledge. So I know I've perhaps had you and other interlocutors sort of bring up the example of like queer astrology as sort of a in a sort of tradition of like critique of mainstream psychotherapy that used to, and in some cases still does, pathologize queerness. So I think in some ways it's a real form of critique. But I think you also raised the interesting point about how this also ties to and overlaps with sort of conspiracy theorizing. You often get there are sort of conspiracy forms and some interest in these some of these new age discourses, and I think we do see some of those functions here too. So, and it's a way of, I've heard conspiracy theorizing referred to as a form of rational enchantment, a way of sort of finding a sort of satisfaction in the coherence of things with a sense that you're being a rational thinker too, still a modern person.
Thank you. The next question comes from my colleague, Dan McCannon, who asks, do you see these women as fully immersed in the milieu of theosophy and occult revival? Or does their degree of scholarly engagement set them apart? I ask in part because I've wondered the same thing about the circle of theosophists who funded Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions.
From where I am speaking, so I'm feeling very sort of infused with that. So it actually varies to a degree. So I would say that to some degree, all these women are engaging with theosophical theories and the sort of theosophical influence on early comparative religion, which is already sort of like in play by the end of the 19th century. But Weston is the only one with anything close to a sort of theosophical affiliation. And in her case, it's still made through disavowal. So she claims that she is not an occult initiate, but she has friends who are, and they're like her native informants. So she'll quote Yeats on modern magic as a friend who sort of informed her about like what modern magicians are practicing today. And she was a part and published in the Quest Society's journal. And this was a society founded by a former prominent theosophist, G.R.S. Mead, who had been secretary to Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, and in line to become president, but he left, founded the Quest Society instead as something that was sort of separate from Theosophy, but arguably in a way that was sort of like, we're more theosophical than the theosophists because we're like less indebted to dogma and creeds. They've become too dogmatic. We're going beyond.
Thank you. Lee Bellman asks, he says, I love your list of writers influenced by these thinkers at the end. I wonder what you might do with the troublesome figure of Camille Paglia.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Yeah, so Camille Paglia has also, should be on that list as sort of a scholarly literary writer, who's also part of the reception of these thinkers in sort of second wave feminism, arguably. She is a great champion of Jane Harrison, and kind of like Mary Daly has become a sort of controversial figure in histories of feminism. And so for me, I think it's telling that the sort of more visible reception of Harrison and some of her peers and figures like Daly and Paglia, who herself sometimes comes in for criticism for being too amateurish or somehow not like scholarly rigorous enough, becomes sort of another sort of part of the way there's this sort of gender of bad enchantment and bad religion that gets deployed to sort of keep these figures from being a part of a recognizable intellectual history, even though they're clearly there. They keep getting marginalized in sort of similar ways.
We seem to have a lot of people who want to ask about how a specific author fits into this constellation that you have drawn for us. So another figure that there's a question about from Suzanne is one that I'm not familiar with. She asks about the interest in Harrison as a Bloomsbury figure in Wade's Square haunting.
and Wade Square haunting. I'm not sure if I'm quite getting that, but I'm getting the sort of Bloomsbury group of Virginia Woolf and these sort of the bohemian like artists and literary figures, Forrester, the Strackeys and all them. And so Harrison and Woolf knew each other. Woolf talks about going to see Harrison in Paris in her quote unquote Sapphic flat. We haven't even gotten to the queerness of these figures. And Harrison publishes with the Hogarth Press. So she's sort of on the margins of the Bloomsbury group, certainly knew a lot of the same people and had a lot of the same sympathies. Thank you. Francesca Wade Square. Thank you, Kelly. 5 writers in London between the war. I have to read this. I don't know it. So I'll look that up. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Kelly.
And now we have a question from Joy Dixon, the scholar of feminism and theosophy. Welcome, Joy. It's great to have you here from across the pond. Joy is interested in the relationship between these 3 writers and Fraser. Fraser himself saw his project as a secular one, but he was clearly read ecstatically. These writers seem to have a complicated relationship to their readers, simultaneously wanting and not wanting to be read ecstatically. Could you comment more on that ambivalence?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, that Fraser sort of disavowed ecstatic readings of his work. It was very much a sort of rationalist critique of Christianity that he delighted in. And you get echoes of that rationalist critique, particularly in Harrison and Murray, who considered themselves rationalists. Harrison referred to herself as an old rat. But they were more open, and Harrison explicitly so, to the sort of value of religion as what Harrison sometimes termed an impulse that persisted, and that persisted even in the sort of vehicle of scholarship in a way that Fraser would have nothing to do with. And I think this does go back to their slightly divergent theories of religion, that religion for Fraser sort of emerges as a sort of originary error, like a bad hypothesis. Whereas for Harrison, Weston, and Murray, religion has an origin in affect, and not like bad rationality, but just, again, some other way of sort of being and feeling and even thinking. And I think that for them allows them to have a bit more ambivalence in their scholarship and in the way that they were read and received.
Fascinating. We have a really interesting question from Sebastian Lecourt, which I'm glad is not being posed to me. And if I'll leave it up to you whether you want to go into this or perhaps ask Sebastian to reflect on it. Sebastian asks, what do you see as the obstacles to recovering ecstatic inquiry in religious studies today? My own sense, looking at religious studies from the perspective of an English department, is that religious studies remains quite keen on stressing its secular scientific character and distinguishing itself both from 20th century humanistic perennialism and 19th century liberal ecumenical theology. How are the politics of recovering ecstatic or experiential knowledge different in religious studies than in literary studies?
So that's a question I would very much like to hear more of my colleagues here talk about. So, and it's really beautifully worded, Sebastian. I think that one thing I'm seeing here at the Divinity School is a real interest from my religious studies colleagues in recovering what Charles Stang sometimes calls or kind of evoking a sort of seance of these sort of voices from the margins of religious studies, such as the Theosophists, as Dan mentioned, the sort of Center for the Study of World Religions here at Harvard Divinity School, where I am speaking from, was founded by a bequest from a woman who had been part of a Theosophical Society in New York. And religious studies here seems increasingly interested in figuring out these links and how maybe there could be these sort of genealogies of mystical thinking and writing and practice that connect sort of scholarly work to more pastoral work and scholarly work today. And I'm really excited to see that. But I do think that's a change maybe from a variety of fields just a short time ago, where this stuff was written about and spoken about with more embarrassment. So I think there's been such a rich production of scholarship on these areas for the past 20 years especially, and some before that, Anne Browdy, that has sort of made people less embarrassed and sort of given people the platform to ask these questions and pursue them more thoroughly. So I think there's real hope for critical recoveries of these kind of traditions now.
That's a wonderful closing comment to a really stimulating talk. We have come to the end of our time. I'm sorry we didn't get to every single question, but we got to most of them. I hope that what we are seeing in response to Sebastian's question is a real maturation of the field of religious studies, getting over the embarrassments that many kinds of embarrassment that have plagued scholars, both of their own religion and of the religions of others. And Mimi's work is certainly helping us complicate that picture and get into a deeper level of analysis. So please join me in thanking Mimi for a wonderful paper. I know she can't hear our applause, but I hope you can imagine it. Thank you all for joining us and for spending this time with the Women's Studies in Religion program. We look forward to seeing you next month when we'll have a chance to hear about music in women musicians in Iran. And thank you so much for joining us.